Hi, I'm Basarat the TypeScript guy and welcome to my channel. Today's lesson is in a series of lessons in which I cover how I manage layout in the various component libraries that I've worked with. So let's go. One fundamental concept that you should be aware of is how you manage space. Fundamentally, don't camp on external space. And what does that mean in CSS terms? It means that you should not have external margins on components. Well, what are the issues with external margins? Well, fundamentally they are outside the component. That is, in the border box sizing, the margin is outside the width of the component. And when you add margin to a component, the component is essentially taking responsibility for area that it does not control. A secondary issue with margins is that margins collapse. That is, depending upon the siblings of a component, the margin that you set on a component might completely disappear. This can be a maintainability nightmare. Another common issue with margins is that it pollutes layout with logic. Suppose you want to conditionally render a button. If this button is being separated by a margin on the previous button, then that margin would need to disappear depending upon if this button is shown or not. A conditional logic on this button is impacting how you need to design this button. Another issue that I've observed with component libraries out there is that when components come with default margins, it makes pixel-perfect placement of these components impossible. A common offender in the component libraries out there is the button component, which comes with default margins, which makes it impossible to place it reliably. So the question is, if components are coming without margins, how are they being spaced from their neighbors? For example, how is this button being spaced from the input that follows? We'll discuss that next, and in the examples to follow we'll be using components from GLS that reliably manage the space between and around your components. Realize that a component's external space is its parent's internal space, and any component, like a parent component, is free to manage its internal space any way it wants, and it would not conflict with its neighbors. Let's start off with a simple input component that does not pollute any of its external space. This input component is a basic React input component and is not a part of this library. We also have a pure label component, which is just a pure React label and not specific to this library. Now, how do we space this label and this input? Well, we put them in a vertical container and specify the spacing between its children as a property. Now, vertical spaces its children with pure CSS and no runtime inspection is done. This results in browser native performance for layouts done with vertical and any of the other components provided by GLS. And because vertical itself comes without any external margins, it can be easily composed into other verticals. As an example, consider 3 label plus input sets for first name, middle name, and last name. This example is just another vertical that surrounds the label plus input vertical that we have already seen. The inner verticals have a spacing of 5 between the label and the input, and the outer vertical has a spacing of 15 between the label and input sets. We could easily create a field component from these label and inputs and a field set from this outer vertical component. We could continue down this path of reuse, composing one layout into another as much as we want, because all of these components compose nicely without any external margins. Now that we've talked about creating space between the children, let's talk about creating space around the children at the border of the parent component. Quite simply, a parent can create space around the children by using the padding prop. Padding is something that you would intuitively use for any component that has an explicit visually designed border, and a button is a common example. For components that you plan to compose into other components, for example, the 3 first, middle, and last name component that we saw previously, you wouldn't have a padding on that component. And because it doesn't come with padding, it composes nicely. For example, here we have 2 username first, middle, and last name inputs composed along with another set of the same inputs into a full cohesive layout. And that covers the spacing principle. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. The links for the documentation that I've been showing will be in the description. Till next time, like, share, and subscribe. Take care. Bye.